Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Briefing Room. I'm your host, Bill Froehlich from WTCM Radio News. It's our weekly roundup of stories that are making headlines across northern Michigan, and we're talking, as always, with the journalists that cover some of those stories. To my left, Pat Sullivan from Northern Express. Pat, thanks for coming back.
Thanks.
Good to see you. And Peter Payette off to my right from Interlochen Public Radio. Good morning to you, Peter. Hey, I wanted to start with a story, I guess it broke a couple of weeks ago, but it's kind of all of us have piqued interest, to say the least, in a medical marijuana story out of Wexford County, a doctor there that was arrested in essentially a sting operation by the narcotics team for his involvement with medical marijuana patients. Peter, why don't you start us off with what you know and what piqued your interest in this story on a larger scale?
Well, our understanding was he's a radiologist, and I don't know his name. We started talking about this right before we came on, but his name escapes me. But he's a radiologist who has clinics in Ann Arbor and Cadillac, and he was facing some scrutiny from the state attorney general's office going back into last year, and I believe is facing some accusations in front of a medical review board for the conduct of his practice. But in Cadillac, what happened was Traverse Narcotics, the Traverse Narcotics team, the TNT out of Traverse City, conducted some kind of sting and posed as a patient and recorded their interactions, and they accuse the doctor of essentially, after 5 minutes of consultation, writing out the recommendation to get a medical marijuana permit. And they say this does not constitute a bona fide physician-patient relationship, which is a term in the law that has been the subject of some debate, as to what that means. But now the charge is going forward from the Wexford County prosecutor, and there are a few different counts, but the one that was interesting to us was this accusation that he wrote this recommendation without having a bona fide relationship with these patients.
And without doing a thorough examination, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm a little unclear what that means, because the legislature in the lame duck session, when they were piling on new laws, actually added some language to the Medical Marijuana Act to define a bona fide physician-patient relationship. But those changes don't take effect until, I think, sometime in March, or maybe May. But this spring, those will take effect. So this will be, I assume, under the old terms of the law. And my understanding was always that term was very nebulous, and people in the medical community were scratching their heads about what that would actually mean. So,
well, it's a gray area if it's a 10-minute conversation, a 5-minute conversation. Is 14 minutes enough to figure out when a patient
Do you have to go see the doctor for years and then he can know, so that he knows you? I mean, where are they coming from?
Right. And then the other question is who decides? Because the way this is going, it won't be a medical review board deciding whether he behaved appropriately or not. It will be a jury of his peers in Wexford County having to weigh whether or not this was good medicine, and that raises some questions too about who ought to be deciding these things.
It should be an interesting case, because he's in his 70s. He's been a doctor for decades, so he's going to make an interesting defendant. And from what I understand, he didn't just haphazardly stumble his way into this. He was opposed to marijuana for some time, and then he went to a conference a few years ago and studied it and decided that this was actually a legitimate medicine that could benefit some of his patients. And he came to it, from a profile I read from a few years ago, he came to it really genuinely and really believes in it, and he'll make an interesting defendant when they decide to bring him to trial.
As a social matter, you have to wonder about the way other medications are prescribed. I mean, anybody who goes to a therapist and says, I'm having kind of a hard time, you hear stories about the conversation starts with, are you on medication? They're ready to prescribe antidepressants before they've even spoken with you and heard what's going on. And those are, those can be pretty addictive. I've talked to people who have been on antidepressants, and coming off them is no small matter. And of course, we have all the prescription painkillers, which I don't know, but I imagine those are prescribed pretty easily. I've had minor surgeries, and I'll get a Tylenol 3 prescription, and I can, I don't use it at all, or maybe I use it that day, and I could refill it 3 more times. So we're passing out medications in this society pretty easily and quickly. And so now we're going to potentially have a jury trial where these jurors in Wexford County will have to decide if he, jumped the gun. It's odd.
You mentioned, in addition, it makes me think of kids on medicine for attention deficit disorder, and there's that social controversy about whether kids are overprescribed as well, along the same lines in a lot of ways. The other question that it raises for me is, obviously this was a sting operation, and if what you say is right, that a TNT person went in undercover, it also, as a potential juror, it would make me want to know, well, what did that person say? Mm-hmm. And does that just open the door for how much do you have to rely on the potential patient? Because it could have been anybody off the street, and at some point a doctor has to decide what that person says and whether it meets the criteria, and how believable that story is.
Right.
So why is it any different for an undercover operation?
And this is one of the things that the medical marijuana proponents will argue, is that these narcotics officers this is entrapment. That they know how to set a doctor up, and is that really what we want? And then, as another sort of social issue, of all the drug problems we have out there, are the most pressing ones for our special narcotics units to be going after doctors writing medical marijuana recommendations.
We've been hearing a lot lately in Antrim County and Kalkaska and Grand Traverse County this week. So many meth labs getting busted lately. Heroin, prescription drugs. There's a lot going on, and that is an interesting question.
Priorities. Let's talk a little bit about another story in Grand Traverse County this week, and legal issues for a gentleman who brought a gun to a party. Pat, you and I covered this story this week. Peter, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Taksha Milk came into a party armed and dangerous, according to Traverse City Police.
Saturday night, pulled a handgun that had been stolen earlier in the month from a house in Leelanau County.
Right.
He was tackled by, I think, a couple of the partygoers.
Pepper sprayed as well.
Pepper sprayed. They got the gun away from him, and they called the cops, and they got there, but not before this guy had taken off, and he was on the run for 2 days.
They found him Monday evening, and it sounds like from what we were told that he was outside, or the police were outside this home where they believed he was waiting for a warrant, and he heard that they were there and just came out. It was fairly uneventful end to what police were describing, at least Monday morning, as a dangerous situation.
And I did a little bit of research about him. He has a unique name, so you can search him pretty easily. And it seems like he's had some trouble in the past, and it seems like he's had his ups and downs. He had a felony domestic violence case against him in 2006, but then from what I could tell, it looks like he got his life together and became a pretty solid citizen, and there was some mention in one of the, I think, the Grand Traverse Band newsletter in 2009 that he was a 4.0 student at NMC on his way to getting a certificate in an automotive field. Married and doing really well. And then if you look at the records, there was a divorce, there was a domestic violence charge, probably leading to a stumble into this trouble that he's in now.
Did it seem merited? We didn't report on this, but we did discuss the press release that was put out calling him very dangerous. Extremely dangerous, but he wasn't even armed. What was the justification for the police to tell the public that he was extremely dangerous?
They were under the impression that he had, I believe he had access to other weapons, or that there was another gun out there that he could get his hands on, and that he was.
But if they really would have thought
agitated,
if they thought he was really dangerous, they would have released something Saturday night.
Well, that was my question.
Yeah, and they're saying it Monday morning. Right. He was on the run.
That was my question when we first got that press release on Monday. I thought, if this is, how big of a concern is this? 36 hours later,
right?
at our routine meeting time, as opposed to sending out an announcement to any of the press Saturday night, Sunday night, before Monday. Did that strike you as odd too?
Yeah, it indicated to me that they were worried about him, but they weren't that worried about him, maybe.
And it's also possible too that maybe they had either been watching him or had an idea where he was. It wasn't a be on the lookout type situation. But the thought occurred to me as well. Another story that came to a head this week in Traverse City. Traverse City Light and Power Board met to discuss how they're going to replace Executive Director Ed Rice, who was fired last year. Tim Ahrens has been the interim director since that meeting when Ed Rice was fired. And there's some dispute within the board, Peter, about how to go forward. Some of the board members wanted Tim Ahrens to take over the title officially, and obviously the majority weren't quite ready to make that call yet.
Right. Yeah, this story, we talk a lot in our newsroom about what Traverse City issues to cover, and we've paid a fair amount of attention to the utility in the past, and we've justified that by saying our listeners are very interested in energy and what's happening, and in the future with our energy supply, and that what you have in Light and Power is kind of a window on the energy industry, because you can't figure out the first thing that DTE and consumers are doing, and we have co-ops, but it's really all right on display at Traverse City Light and Power. And in the past, the reason we were interested in this dust-up is that in the past, Traverse City Light and Power has tried to position itself as a renewable energy leader. If you go back to the windmill that is the wind turbine out on 72, I think they boasted that it was the first utility in the state to have an industrial scale wind electricity generator, and then they the biomass proposal. They had a goal at one time to have 30% of their energy be renewable energy, and that led to the proposal to build the biomass plant. But then they kind of took their licks, that when the wind turbine was part of a green energy program that a customer could choose to opt into, and so if you wanted, you could pay a little more to have renewable electricity. But they had to stop the program because they just had the one wind turbine, and they decided they didn't want to get out in the townships because it's so controversial trying to site a windmill, and they didn't want to get into that, so they ended that, and then they proposed the biomass plant, and that just blew up in an astonishing way. And so now they have to hire a new director, and so I think one of the questions that's kind of underneath the surface, and it gets sort of lost in all the back and forth about who did what, and are there conversations going on behind closed doors, is what kind of does Traverse City aspire to be a leader in some way in electricity generation, or managing energy in the future, or is the utility just going to sign contracts and pass through electricity to the homes and businesses of Traverse City? And it really seems like an open question, because on Tuesday night you had some of the officials on the board saying, we don't need a leader to help us find a new direction. We need a leader who's just going to, or a director who's just going to do what we tell that person. And you had others saying, no, we need to find a really savvy director who can help us chart a course. In the future, energy is going to be complex. It's not just like the old days where you sign a contract with a coal plant to supply all your electricity. And we need somebody who can help us figure all this stuff out. And there seems to be a real split on how to go forward, and it seemed to me too a fair amount of opposition to renewable energy. I mean, the comments of the chair of the board, Pat McGuire, seemed, I don't know, you might characterize them as sort of hostile to renewable energy, or hostile to a real strong push in that direction. So it seems like there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen there.
Well, two things that strike me coming out of that. One, we talked to Mayor Mike Estes, who is not on the TC Light and Power Board, but he indicated to us that it's his wish that the board decide if they want to be, as you say, a purchaser of energy or a supplier before they go forward and hire a new director. He wants that to get worked out ahead of time. But it raises the question for me is, how much influence does the mayor have on this board? He's not a voting member of it, but he's on the committee that will choose the board members.
Right.
Mike Coco, one of the longer serving members, is up this year. And the mayor, I believe I saw in Record Eagle, it indicated he wasn't supportive of keeping Mike Coco on.
Right.
Mike Coco wanted to keep Ed Rice on the board. So it just makes me wonder who has the influence, and is there some underlying shift that's been building for years, and we're
Right.
still on that path.
And the mayor has been quoted in years past saying we could sell the utility. And what really caught some people's attention was a couple weeks ago, up until 2 weeks ago, the utility had been, the board had been making preparations to post a job position and do a nationwide search for the best director. And then 2 weeks ago at a meeting, the mayor, the head of the Traverse City Area Chamber of Commerce, Doug Luciani, and curiously, Tony Anderson, the head of Cherryland Electric, sort of a competitor. They don't compete a lot, but there have been. I mean, at one point, Traverse City Light and Power and Cherryland were involved in litigation over who would get to supply electricity to the Great Wolf Lodge. So he showed up, and all three of them said, "Ahrens is our guy. Just hire him. Forget posting the position." And people who were interested in this were saying, "Whoa, where did this come from? Why all of a sudden is there this turn away from going through a search process and to this view of just hire the guy that we have right here?" And I guess that the people who were proposing that, like Doug Luciani, were defending that, saying, well, we've been talking about this for 12 months. But it's still unclear to me what changed that would cause the mayor and others to say, we don't need to search for the best candidate. We've got him right here.
I think there does seem to be something else kind of bubbling up under the surface there. The other thing that stands out for me is, I don't know what you make of this controversy with the Land Use Institute. And again, the mayor saying that they're lobbying Light and Power to go in a certain direction for a new hire, focus on renewable energy and alternative energy. And the Land Use Institute basically just said, well, you asked for public comment, we're giving you a comment on what we think. Is it getting overblown, or is the mayor off base and making a big deal out of it?
I don't know. I sort of, there does seem to be an effort to kind of paint people as representing particular interests. I mean, the head of the Land Use Institute, Hans Voss, lives in Traverse City. He's a Traverse City Light and Power customer, or ratepayer, as they say. Yeah, I don't know. That is an odd one. But it did seem in the kind of the tone of the conversation, it was trying to pit the Land Use Institute against the interests of the citizens of Traverse City, and I'm not sure what's objectionable about a group that clearly has an agenda and they're promoting certain things and they're trying to make their voice heard, and anyone else who wants to do that can do that. I mean, a grand total of 11 people spoke at the meeting, and it's my understanding that the board was surprised by that much public input. So it's not as though they're being overwhelmed with other people's ideas. So I don't know.
Well, let's shift gears here. We'll tackle one more story before we take a quick break on the briefing room. And Pat Sullivan, I'll go back over to you. Tell us about the story you worked on this week. It's a building that probably everyone in Traverse City has driven by at one point or another, and it's been a lot of different things over the years. But we're talking about the corner of 8th and Woodmere, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because of the nature of the publication that I work for, the Northern Express, sometimes we have special issues, and we had our home issue this week, and so we looked for a story that would be I wanted to do a story that would show an interesting reuse of an old building, and that one kind of jumps out at you. You drive by it every day, and it was the fitness center in the 80s and 90s. It's got a pretty interesting history. What's going on there now is Victoria and Matt Sutherland purchased it a couple years ago. They're doing a renovation of the building, turning it into their house. On the top floor, they've got offices for their business, Forward magazine. They're going to get to the basement. The whole building is 12,000 square feet. When I was inside, it's what they've done on the main floor where they're living is incredible. they're planning on having events there and kind of like having cooking classes and weddings. They hope to open it up in that way.
I've kind of wondered what, because when I drive by there, obviously over the past year or 2 years, you've seen ferns in the window and just kind of wondering what's going on in there. So is there any public use now in terms of it being open for business in some way, shape, or form?
They've got the offices that are being used up top. On the main floor, they've just started to have cooking classes and stuff.
Okay.
If you can go on their Facebook page and under the box, and they advertise those there.
Are there still remnants though of the gym or the fitness center in there too?
Down below, there's still the aerobics studio, which they hope to turn into a dance floor, and the locker rooms are still there. And there's remnants of the cigar factory that was there. The building was built in 1920, and it's kind of the story of the building. What I found interesting is the story of the building, in a lot of ways, is the story of Traverse City. It came along in 1920, just when the last of the hardwood had been cut. So Traverse City was at a crossroads. It had been a lumber economy up until then, but then the wood was all gone, and I think at that time people were wondering, what are we going to do to make a living up here now? And it was at a time when men all smoked cigars, and there were a dozen cigar manufacturers in town, because they'd import the tobacco from somewhere tropical and bring it up here and roll the cigars. So somebody needed to make the cigar boxes, and it was a savior for the Boardman neighborhood in the 1920s. It provided work to a dozen or so women making these cigars, and it got them through the 20s and 30s.
Oh, see, we made the cigars up here too.
They rolled the cigars up here, and then there were like a ton of people working. I think that was a man's job, rolling the cigars, and then
and the women made the boxes.
The women made the boxes.
We still had enough wood to make boxes.
They were made out of cedar, and I think cedar was like that.
It was left behind.
Was one of
Well, let's take a break here on the briefing room. We'll be back in just a minute to touch on a couple more quick stories and wrap things up this week. We'll be right back.
What is Up North TV?
It's TV that you do.
You pick the topic.
You write the script. You run the camera.
You edit the video.
It's your vision.
Your perspective.
Your story.
Commercial free.
Free speech.
What is Up North TV?
It's me.
It's you.
It's all of us.
View us on Analog 97.
Cable digital too.
Digital 992.
UpNorthMedia.org.
Welcome back to the briefing room. I'm Bill Froehlich, joined this week by Pat Sullivan and Peter Payette. And let's shift gears here in the closing moments to talk about a meeting in Benzie County last night, Peter, which IPR attended or covered in terms of fracking. We've talked about this before. Pat, I know you've done stories in Kalkaska County as well. But the interesting thing, I guess, that jumped out as we were talking earlier, Peter, was that you've got a well-attended public meeting, but not necessarily any looming or pending fracking happening in Benzie County.
Right. Well, and that was the one thing we couldn't get to I was the moderator. I was invited to moderate this panel. And, the question I really want to have answered is this going to happen? Are we going to see an explosion?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah,
well, that's one we're waiting for the answer to.
Right, we're all waiting, and that's the one people. But
2 hours and you didn't get an
well,
answer.
the thing was the questions were the way they did it. We didn't have a mic on the floor, so the people were submitting questions on cards, and I'm sitting at this table, and I mean the cards are just piling up, and so I'm trying to honor that this is their forum. It's to answer their questions.
Generally, what was the quality of the questions?
Well, so people were really focused in on water usage, and I think that was in part because Glenn Pewitt at the Record Eagle had recently reported on how much water was used at some wells that were recently drilled in Kalkaska County. And I think, I may be incorrect here, but I think 3 wells together used a total of 42 million gallons of water. And so that's a one-time use. It's not like Ice Mountain that's drawing large volumes of water steadily. But there are a lot of questions about how good a job the state is doing protecting watersheds, from severe impacts when, all of a sudden 20 million gallons of water is drawn for, a single well. It's a huge amount of water to take out of the groundwater table, or I'm not sure if maybe sometimes it's actually drawn out of a river. I guess it would always come from deep down. But so there were a lot of questions about that. One interesting thing that came up was in the about the chemicals. There's this issue of why don't we know what chemicals they're shooting down into these wells to frack them? And Jim Olson, the attorney who's been really opposed to a lot of what's happening and how it's being handled, he raised the point that if we want, most of the drilling is being done on state land. So if we want to know what chemicals are being used, just tell them they can't get a lease for state mineral rights until they fully disclose everything that they're doing, which is clearly something the state could do, but is not.
But the problem has been all along that the state has been colluding with the companies to do what they want with, in the law, they allow these things to be kept from public disclosure anyway.
Well, apparently, and I didn't quite follow this, but both the state representative and Jim Olson said federal law ties the hands of the state somewhat in terms of what they can require, that it may not be solely at the discretion of the state to require full disclosure. And they both said that. Jim didn't dispute that. But
that's interesting.
But yeah, and I didn't press in on the details. And that's the difficulty of this, is knowing which are the important details.
How did this come about in the first place? Again, if there are no proposed well sites in Benzie, was there just this mass community concern that brought the meeting to a head?
No, I don't think so. The Conservation District just wants to put together programs now and then that are, have to do with the issues that they work in. And they had apparently done a survey and asked, who would be interested in coming to a forum about fracking. And a lot of people said yes, and almost 200 people showed up.
Yeah, I was going to say, clearly it resonated with some people, regardless. We are just about out of time here on the briefing room. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. You can always read our blog. I hope you'll catch the rebroadcast or watch us online if you're joining us late. And I want to thank Peter Payette from Interlochen Public Radio, Pat Sullivan from Northern Express.
Thanks.
Thank you guys for coming in. And I'm Bill Froehlich from WTCM Radio. Have a great week. We'll see you next time in the briefing room.